Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back into the dimly lit corridors of palaces that smelled faintly of candle smoke, damp stone, and bad decisions. So settle in, lower the lights, let your shoulders drop a little. This evening, we're talking about royal mistresses, who had an unfortunate habit of dying, being deposed, or suddenly deciding they'd never met her in their lives. Because being the king's favorite was only a good idea while the king was alive, in power, and vaguely fond of you. The moment any of those conditions changed, things tended to unravel, slowly, awkwardly, and often expensively. So let's begin gently. No sharp turns, just a quiet walk through history's most uncomfortable aftermaths. Royal mistresses occupied a strange, unstable space. They were not wives, so they had no legal protection. They were not servants, so they had no job security. They were not royalty, so they had no divine right to exist once things went wrong. They were tolerated, sometimes celebrated, sometimes resented, and always, always expendable. Let's drift back to medieval France, because of course we are. France had an especially robust tradition of royal mistresses, treated almost like an unofficial office. There were apartments, stipends, jewels, and occasionally titles, but none of it was guaranteed. Everything depended on one fragile thing: the king's continued breathing. When King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, despite looking permanently irritated by his own existence, died suddenly in 1314, the women attached to his court discovered just how fast favor evaporated. Philip himself wasn't especially known for mistresses, but his sons were, and their wives, famously, were not amused. This is where things start to get messy in a very quiet, bureaucratic way. When a king died, his household dissolved almost immediately. Servants were reassigned, accounts were audited, and mistresses were, quite literally, crossed off lists. Their rooms were reclaimed, their jewelry reclassified as royal property, their allowances quietly discontinued. If they were lucky, they were given a modest pension and told to retire somewhere discreet. A convent was popular. Not always for religious reasons, mostly because convents were cheap, controlled, and far away from politics. If they were unlucky, they were accused of corruption, sorcery, or simply knowing too much, which was often worse. Let's drift forward a little to England, where the treatment of royal mistresses ranged from grudging tolerance to outright hostility. Edward II's reign is usually remembered for his intense attachment to male favorites, but he also had mistresses. And when Edward was overthrown in 1327, deposed by his wife, Isabella of France, and her new partner, Roger Mortimer, the people associated with him found themselves in a dangerous position. Mistresses, especially, were liabilities. They were living reminders of the king's personal life, and in a coup, personal lives become evidence. Some were imprisoned briefly, some were stripped of lands, others vanished from the records altogether, which is historian shorthand for something unpleasant happened and no one bothered to write it down. And then there's the particularly cruel category, the mistress who outlived the king but not his reputation. Let's talk about Agnes Sorel. She was the official mistress of Charles VII of France in the mid-15th century. And yes, official is the correct word. She was publicly acknowledged, lavishly dressed, and scandalously influential. Agnes wore plunging gowns that revealed one breast at court, because naturally she did. She had opinions on politics, because naturally she did. And she was deeply disliked by many nobles, because naturally they were furious. When Agnes died suddenly in 1450, possibly from mercury poisoning, rumors immediately bloomed. Some suspected the Dauphin, later Louis XI. Others blamed jealous courtiers. Charles VII was devastated. But here's the important part. Agnes died before Charles did. Had she survived him, her fate would almost certainly have been exile, or worse, because royal mistresses were tolerated only while they were useful. Once the king was gone, affection curdled into inconvenience. Let's drift gently toward Henry VIII, because of course we are. Henry collected wives, but he also had mistresses, and the women involved learned very quickly that his affection had an expiration date. Take Elizabeth Blount, his early mistress and the mother of his acknowledged illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. For a brief moment, Elizabeth was powerful. She had the king's favor. She had borne him a son. She had hope. Then Henry lost interest, as he tended to do. Elizabeth was married off quickly to a compliant nobleman and removed from the court. Not violently, not dramatically, just quietly, like clearing away furniture. She lived out her life in relative obscurity, her connection to the king becoming something polite people avoided mentioning. She was lucky. She survived. Many didn't fare as well. Mistresses who bore children were particularly vulnerable after a king's death. Those children could be seen as threats, symbols of instability, or inconvenient reminders of scandal. In Spain, the Habsburgs handled this problem with bureaucratic efficiency. Mistresses were often married off, sent to convents, or financially compensated in exchange for permanent silence. But when a king died unexpectedly, those arrangements could collapse overnight. Take Philip IV of Spain. His court was filled with women whose status depended entirely on his attention. When he died in 1665, his widow and ministers immediately set about cleansing the court. Mistresses were dismissed, their pensions reviewed, their letters confiscated, and their movements restricted. One woman, Maria Calderon, an actress turned mistress, had borne Philip an illegitimate son. After his death, she was pressured into a convent, not violently, just persistently, which was often enough. She spent the rest of her life there, alive, quiet, erased. Let's drift north for a moment, to Scandinavia, where royal mistresses sometimes fared slightly better. Sometimes. Christian IV of Denmark had several long-term mistresses, most notably Kirsten Munk, who bore him 12 children. They were never legally married, but she was treated almost like a queen. Almost. When Christian died in 1648, Kirsten's position collapsed. She was accused of infidelity, stripped of privileges, and exiled to an estate where she lived under supervision. Her children, despite being royal blood, were sidelined, titles reduced, influence curtailed. They were reminders of a chapter the new regime preferred to forget. And that's a recurring theme here. Mistresses belonged to chapters. When the chapter ended, so did their relevance. For some, though, the end came not with death, but with overthrow. Let's drift softly toward France again, where political upheaval was practically a hobby. Madame de Pompadour, mistress to Louis XV, was an exception in many ways. She survived changes in favor, court intrigue, and widespread hatred, but only because she died before the king. Had she survived him, her fate would almost certainly have been exile, or worse. Mistresses who were not so fortunate enjoyed her luck. During the French Revolution, women associated with the Ancien regime were rounded up, imprisoned, and executed. Mistresses, former mistresses, and rumored mistresses all blurred together in the public imagination. Once a symbol of luxury, they became symbols of corruption. Jeanne du Barry, the last mistress of Louis XV, is a particularly somber example. After the king's death, she lived quietly, trying to fade into the background, but her past clung to her. During the Revolution, she was arrested, tried, and guillotined in 1793. Her crime was not treason, it was memory, being remembered as someone the king loved. Let's pause here for a moment. Not dramatically, just gently. Because what's striking isn't cruelty for its own sake, it's how administrative everything feels. Mistresses weren't usually dragged screaming from palaces. They were audited, reassigned, relocated, neutralized. History often imagines royal courts as places of passion and intrigue, and they were. But when things ended, they ended quietly, with paperwork. A canceled allowance, a locked door, a polite suggestion to take vows. So as we drift toward the next set of stories, keep that in mind, that for many women, being loved by a king was not a fairy tale. It was a temporary contract,